What happens when a country refuses to obey the strongest nation on earth? Today, the world is watching something very unusual. Nigeria, the largest country in Africa and one of the most important on the continent, is standing up to the United States. President Donald Trump has warned Nigeria that there may be serious consequences, even military action, but Nigeria has not changed its position. It is saying firmly and clearly, we will decide our own future. This is not just a small argument between two governments. It shows a much bigger change in how the world is working. For many years, smaller or weaker countries often followed whatever the United States demanded. The U.S. had military power, money, and influence. If Washington gave an order, most nations listened, but that time is slowly ending. Countries like Nigeria are beginning to say no. Nigeria is important not only because of its size. It has more than 200 million people and huge natural wealth, oil, natural gas, gold, and other valuable minerals. Both the United States and China want good relations with Nigeria because of these resources. But Nigeria is not only valuable, it is also confident. It is now leading a new wave of independence across Africa. Many African nations are rejecting old patterns of control and are learning to act on their own terms. In the past, when the United States wanted something, it would often use pressure, economic, political, or even military. A few threats or sanctions were enough to make most governments agree, but that system is no longer working. Nigeria's refusal to back down is a sign that the balance of power is changing. For the first time in decades, a major African nation is showing that independence can be stronger than fear. The question is not just whether Trump will take action. The real question is, what does this conflict tell us about the new world order? Are we entering a time of negotiation where countries respect each other more, or are we heading toward a dangerous confrontation that could lead to disaster? To answer this, we need to look back at how we got here. Nigeria's current position is not a sudden event. It did not happen because of one tweet or one speech. It is the result of years, even decades, of broken promises, unfair treatment, and growing frustration. For many Nigerians, disappointment with the United States runs deep. When people in Lagos or Abuja talk about America, they do not speak with hatred. They speak with sadness. They were promised partnership, development, and democracy. But what they received instead were economic programs that hurt the poor, trade deals that favored foreign companies, and security help that often served American interests more than Nigeria's own needs. During the 1980s and 1990s, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank forced Nigeria to accept structural adjustment programs. These programs demanded cuts to education, healthcare, and public spending. They opened markets to foreign goods while making local industries weaker. The result was rising poverty and unemployment. Instead of helping, these Western policies made Nigeria more dependent. Now, decades later, the same story continues. Promises of partnership have not been kept. The U.S. talks about supporting democracy and prosperity, but it often acts to protect its own strategic and financial power. So when Trump threatened Nigeria, it felt like a familiar pattern, another powerful leader trying to force obedience. But this time, something is different. Nigeria has options. It has friends. It has pride. This moment marks a turning point not only for Nigeria but for all nations that have long lived under the shadow of global superpowers. The coming conflict, whether it stays diplomatic or becomes dangerous, will test more than just strength. It will test principles, sovereignty, fairness, and the right of nations to control their own futures. To understand why Nigeria is standing up to the United States, we need to look closely at its growing friendship with China. This new relationship is one of the biggest reasons behind the current tension. For decades, Nigeria asked Western countries for help to build roads, railways, and power plants. Again and again, Western lenders promised assistance, but the help came with difficult conditions. They demanded privatization, budget cuts, and policies that gave foreign companies control over Nigerian industries. The result was frustration. Nigeria had the resources but not the infrastructure. It had the people but not the factories or technology. So when China arrived with a new offer, it felt like a breath of fresh air. China's approach was different. Instead of giving lectures about reforms, it came with money, engineers, and construction plans. In Abuja, Chinese firms began building modern railways. In Lagos, they worked on ports and refineries. In the north, they invested in solar power and telecom projects. All these were things Nigeria had wanted for decades, and they were finally becoming real. For Western countries, this was alarming. They accused China of debt-trap diplomacy, saying that Beijing was giving loans that would make African countries dependent. There is truth in those concerns. Chinese projects sometimes use imported labor, ignore local laws, or create debt that can be hard to repay. But for many Nigerians, those problems still seem better than the endless waiting and broken promises from Western partners. For years, the World Bank and IMF produced thick reports about Nigeria's development potential. They organized conferences and sent consultants, but very few of those ideas ever turned into actual projects. Chinese investments, on the other hand, led to real, visible change: trains running, bridges completed, new airports opening. Nigerians began to see a clear difference. The Western model spoke of reforms. The Chinese model delivered results. That doesn't mean China is perfect, but it gave Nigeria choices, and that choice is what the West never wanted it to have. The United States watched this shift with growing unease. It wasn't just about business competition, it was about influence. For decades, America saw Africa as its partner, and sometimes its junior partner. Now it faced a situation where a major African country was openly balancing between East and West, refusing to take sides. When Nigeria signed a major agreement with China to build new railways and industrial parks, Washington felt threatened. These were not small contracts, they were worth billions of dollars. And they were tied to Chinese technology and supply chains, meaning that China would have long-term influence over Nigeria's economy. Trump's administration began to see this as more than just trade. It became a political issue, a challenge to U.S. authority in Africa. The message from Washington was clear: you're either with us or with them. But Nigeria's message was equally clear: we're with ourselves. This shift is part of a larger story across the developing world. Many nations are tired of being told how to run their economies by outside powers. They want roads, power, and education, not lectures about governance. They want to build, not just borrow. China provided a model of fast, visible development, something Africa had been asking for since independence. And even though Chinese loans come with their own risks, they at least gave countries like Nigeria a sense of control. They could decide their projects, negotiate terms, and see results within years instead of decades. This is why Washington misread the situation. It thought that Nigeria was simply turning anti-American, but in truth Nigeria was turning pro-Nigerian. It was not choosing China because it loved Beijing. It was choosing progress because it needed to build. By the time the U.S. realized how deep this partnership had grown, it was already too late. Chinese companies had built ports, railways, and even defense equipment. And now China was becoming Nigeria's top trade partner. In this new world, the U.S. could no longer expect automatic loyalty. The balance had changed, and Nigeria had found its voice. Energy is the heart of Nigeria's economy, and also one of the main reasons for its current clash with the United States. Nigeria is the largest oil producer in Africa and has one of the biggest natural gas reserves in the world. For years, Western countries relied on Nigerian oil, especially during times of crisis in the Middle East. But the relationship was rarely fair. Nigeria exported raw materials and imported finished goods. Profits often went to foreign companies, while Nigerian communities near oil fields were left poor and polluted. After Russia invaded Ukraine, the global energy system changed dramatically. Europe suddenly needed new suppliers to replace Russian gas. Nigeria became a natural option. It had the gas reserves and the infrastructure to help Europe, but this time Nigeria refused to be treated like a junior partner. Instead of signing the same old deals that only benefited Western buyers, it demanded fair terms. When European and American companies approached Abuja, Nigerian negotiators made clear demands. They wanted technology transfers, joint ownership with local companies, and financial help to build renewable energy systems. They wanted to use the profits from gas not only to export energy but to power Nigeria's own industries and create jobs. This was a bold change. In the past, Western oil giants controlled most of the process. Now, Nigeria was insisting on national benefit first. The United States did not like this approach. It viewed Nigeria's new toughness as uncooperative. But from Nigeria's point of view, it was simple fairness. They were not saying no to business, they were saying no to exploitation. Then came the real turning point. The currency decision. In early statements, President Bola Tinubu's government announced that Nigeria would start accepting payment for its oil and gas exports in multiple currencies, not just the US dollar. That meant buyers could use Chinese yuan, euros, or even the Nigerian naira. To many people, this seemed like a small economic change. But in truth, it was revolutionary. For decades, global oil and gas have been traded mostly in dollars. This petrodollar system gave the United States enormous power. Because oil must be bought with dollars, all countries need to hold large reserves of US currency that allows America to print money, borrow cheaply, and use its financial system as a weapon when needed. If a country displeases Washington, it can be cut off from dollar transactions, effectively shutting it out of world trade. So when Nigeria declared it would sell oil in other currencies, it challenged that system directly. It was not attacking the US militarily. It was attacking its financial dominance. The response from Washington was furious. President Trump publicly warned that any country moving away from the dollar would face serious consequences. Behind closed doors, US officials began discussing economic sanctions and even military options to protect American interests. This was the moment when the standoff turned dangerous. For the US, the issue was about maintaining control over the global economy. For Nigeria, it was about independence, the right to make decisions that serve its people. Trump's language was unusually harsh. He used words like vicious and hinted at military consequences. For many Nigerians, it was shocking to hear such open threats over something as peaceful as currency policy. But Nigeria stayed calm. President Tinubu addressed the nation in a calm, clear tone. He said Nigeria seeks partnership, not confrontation, but that economic sovereignty is non-negotiable. He reminded everyone that decisions about Nigeria's trade and money will always be made in Abuja, not in Washington or Beijing. This statement was powerful. It told the world that Nigeria would not be bullied. The message resonated across Africa, from Nairobi to Johannesburg, from Addis Ababa to Cairo. Many nations saw themselves in Nigeria's struggle. For them, it was not just about oil or dollars, it was about the freedom to choose their own path. As tensions rose, Nigeria began quiet but effective diplomacy. It reached out to the African Union asking for continental support. It spoke with BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, to strengthen political and economic ties. Even some European nations quietly sympathized, worried that America's aggression could cause global instability. Nigeria's strategy was smart. It could not defeat the US in war, but it could make any attack look politically and morally wrong. If America struck, the world would see it as bullying, a rich nation punishing a developing one for daring to make an independent economic choice. In this way, Nigeria used diplomacy as its shield. Its power did not come from weapons, but from wisdom, from knowing that in today's connected world, perception can be more powerful than military strength. Nigeria's confidence has not only appeared in trade or energy, it is also visible in how the country speaks on the world stage. In the past, Nigeria usually followed Western nations during international votes, especially at the United Nations. If America or Europe supported a resolution, Nigeria often agreed. That pattern lasted for decades, partly because of aid, debt, and diplomatic pressure. But now that old obedience is fading. Today, Nigeria votes based on its own values and interests, not out of fear or loyalty. This new attitude first became clear during votes on the Russia-Ukraine war. When the United Nations asked countries to condemn Russia's invasion, Nigeria did not immediately take sides. Instead, it chose to abstain, not because it supported aggression, but because it wanted fairness and consistency. Many Nigerians asked a hard question. How can the same countries that invaded Iraq without permission, destroyed Libya after promising limited intervention, and ignored decades of occupation in Palestine, now claim to defend sovereignty? Nigeria's leaders said openly that international law should apply to everyone, not just to enemies of the West. This was a moral and independent stand, not pro-Russia, not anti-America, but pro-justice. For many people in Washington, this attitude was frustrating. They saw Nigeria's neutrality as disobedience. But for Africans, it was a moment of pride. For the first time in years, an African power was refusing to repeat Western talking points. Nigeria was saying, We will think for ourselves. This independence in foreign policy reflects a deeper change. Nigeria is no longer acting alone. It is working closely with other African nations like South Africa, Kenya, and Ethiopia to shape a shared African voice. These countries are tired of being treated as pawns in great power rivalries. They are building what diplomats now call strategic autonomy, the ability to choose partners freely without being forced to take sides. In 2024 and 2025, several meetings between African leaders showed this trend clearly. At the African Union and the BRICS summits, Nigeria's representatives spoke about a third path, not siding fully with the US or China, but cooperating with both where it benefits Africa. They said Africa will not be another battlefield in a new Cold War. This statement drew applause from across the continent. For ordinary Nigerians, this new diplomatic voice brings hope. It means their country is being respected again, not as a dependent but as an equal. In the past, international media often showed Africa as a place of crisis, aid, and corruption. Now they are forced to see it as a place of negotiation, confidence, and rising power. Still, independence comes with risk. The United States and some Western allies are not used to hearing no from African partners. They may respond with pressure, cutting aid, delaying loans, or spreading stories that question Nigeria's democracy. But Nigeria's government believes that respect must be earned, not begged for. It has begun building stronger ties with the African Union, the Arab League, and even Latin American nations who share similar experiences of Western domination. There is also a spiritual side to this shift. Many Nigerian thinkers see it as part of Africa's long struggle to escape the shadow of colonialism. They say this is not only politics, it is psychology. For too long, African nations were told that progress depended on following Western rules. Now they are realizing that dignity begins when you stop asking for permission. Nigeria's diplomatic position has also helped it gain influence in peacekeeping and mediation. It has offered to help negotiate in global conflicts, from Sudan to the Middle East, presenting itself as a neutral, respected voice. The more Nigeria acts independently, the more the world listens. And the more it listens, the more America's traditional dominance weakens. In Washington, this new reality is hard to accept. For decades, the U.S. assumed that African votes at the UN were guaranteed, but that assumption no longer holds. Nigeria's abstention on key resolutions sent a message to the world: Africa is not a follower anymore. It is a participant, a player, and sometimes a leader. This is why the current tension is about more than just oil or currency. It is about something deeper: respect. Nigeria is demanding to be treated as a partner, not a subordinate. And for the rest of Africa, that message feels long overdue. To understand the full danger Nigeria faces, we must look not only at threats from outside, but also at the struggles inside the country itself. Nigeria is a proud and powerful nation, but it is also deeply complex. It is not one simple, united society. It is made up of many ethnic groups, religions, and regions that often disagree about how the country should be run. In the north, most people are Muslim, and the economy depends heavily on farming and trade across the Sahara. In the south, where most people are Christian, the economy is driven by oil, ports, and business centers like Lagos. In between lies the Middle Belt, a mix of cultures, where farmers and herders often clash over land and resources. These differences are not new. They have existed since colonial times, when the British joined many diverse regions into one large territory and called it Nigeria. But in modern times, these divisions have often been used by politicians and sometimes by foreign powers to create conflict and control. The Niger Delta, for example, is rich in oil but poor in opportunity. For decades, communities there have complained that they see no benefit from the oil wealth taken from their land. Pollution has destroyed farms and fishing waters, while multinational companies make billions in profit. The anger has led to protests, sabotage, and violence. Some militant groups have even demanded independence for the Delta region. In the north, extremist groups like Boko Haram have used poverty and unemployment to recruit followers. They tell young people that the government in Abuja does not care about them. The result has been years of violence, kidnappings, and fear. The Nigerian army has fought bravely, but without strong economic development and education, these problems continue. Foreign governments watch these divisions closely. American intelligence agencies, like many others, study Nigeria's internal politics in great detail, and history shows that when a powerful country cannot control another through diplomacy, it sometimes tries to exploit its weaknesses. We have seen this happen before. In Libya, Western nations said they were helping to protect civilians, but the intervention destroyed the country and left it divided. In Syria, outside powers supported different rebel groups, turning a local uprising into a long and bloody war. In Sudan, internal conflicts have been made worse by outside funding and weapons. Nigeria's leaders know this. They understand that if Washington or its allies wanted to weaken them, they could support opposition figures, encourage separatist movements, or spread false stories about corruption and instability. That is why unity inside the country has become more important than ever. If Nigerians are divided, it becomes easier for foreign powers to interfere. If they stand together, no outside force can easily control them. Civil society, the journalists, students, and activists, also plays a huge role in this internal battle. Across universities and news outlets, people are talking about sovereignty, dignity, and justice. They are comparing today's Nigeria to the struggles faced by past African heroes. Names like Patrice Lumumba and Thomas Sankara are being spoken again, leaders who tried to build truly independent nations but were killed or overthrown because they challenged Western interests. Many Nigerians see history repeating itself. They know that standing up to a superpower can be dangerous, but they also know that silence and obedience lead only to more dependency. So the debate inside Nigeria is deep and emotional. Should the country play it safe and avoid conflict, even if it means giving up control? Or should it take the risk of standing firm, even if the consequences are uncertain? This question touches every family, every business, every village. People understand that what is happening now will shape their children's future. If Nigeria loses this struggle, it could return to being a nation controlled by others. But if it wins, even peacefully, through unity and diplomacy, it could become a symbol for all of Africa, showing that independence is possible in the 21st century. This is why Nigeria's fight is not just about politics or money. It is about identity. It is about whether the world's largest black nation will continue to live under the shadow of others or finally define its own destiny. The struggle within is as serious as the pressure from outside. For Nigeria to succeed, it must overcome corruption, inequality, and division, and it must do so without losing its democratic soul. That is a hard path to walk, but it is the only one that leads to true sovereignty. For many years, the United States stood alone as the most powerful country in the world. After the Cold War ended in the early 1990s, America became what people called a global superpower. Its military was stronger than any other. Its dollar ruled world trade, its companies controlled global markets, and its culture, movies, technology, even ideas spread everywhere. Most nations, including Nigeria, learned that it was safer to follow America's lead than to challenge it. But now, that world is changing fast. Other nations have grown stronger economically, politically, and even militarily. The United States is still powerful, but it no longer stands alone. The world is slowly moving from one power to many powers, what experts call a multipolar world. China is now the world's largest economy when measured by purchasing power. It produces most of the goods people use every day, from phones to cars to solar panels. India has become a major technology and manufacturing hub. Brazil, Indonesia, and Saudi Arabia are rising regional powers. And in Africa, Nigeria is leading a new generation of nations that no longer want to be treated as weak dependents. This global shift is not only about numbers, it's about attitude. Countries that once felt small are learning to speak with confidence. They are forming alliances like BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, to build their own systems of trade, banking, and technology. These alliances allow them to deal directly with each other instead of going through Western institutions like the World Bank or IMF. For the United States, this new reality is uncomfortable. For decades, it could use its influence to shape decisions everywhere: who got loans, who faced sanctions, and even which governments survived. But now that control is weakening. The US dollar, which once seemed untouchable, is being challenged as more countries trade in their own currencies. Nations are questioning why one country should have so much power over the global economy. This is the real reason why Nigeria's decision to sell oil in other currencies matters so much. It's not just about one country, it's part of a wider movement to reduce dependence on the dollar and therefore on the United States. For America, this feels like losing control of the steering wheel of the world. For countries like Nigeria, it feels like finally learning to drive their own car. As the balance shifts, something else is happening too. Fear. History shows that when great powers begin to lose dominance, they often react aggressively. Instead of adapting to change, they try to force the world back into old patterns. That is what many analysts believe we are seeing in Trump's threats against Nigeria. It is not a rational strategy, it is a reaction born of frustration. America is still powerful, but its power no longer guarantees obedience. That is hard for Washington to accept. For decades, American leaders could issue a warning and most nations would comply. Now, when countries like Nigeria, Brazil, or Indonesia say no, the old methods, threats, and sanctions don't work as easily. The truth is, the United States is facing a choice. It can accept the new multipolar world and learn to cooperate as one major power among many, or it can keep trying to dominate, risking isolation and conflict. The same choice also faces countries like China and Russia, whether to compete for control or build systems based on respect and cooperation. For Nigeria, this new world order offers both opportunities and dangers. It can gain power by being independent, but it can also become a target for pressure from both sides. That's why Nigeria's leaders are trying to balance carefully. They don't want to be forced into an alliance that limits their freedom. They want to build a future where Africa deals with all powers, the US, China, Europe, and others, from a position of equality. This is the world of the 21st century, not one empire commanding all, but many centers of power learning to live together. If nations can adapt, the future could be more balanced and fair. But if old powers cling to the past, then confrontation, like the one now growing between the US and Nigeria, may become more common. The story of Nigeria today is not just about one country. It is a mirror showing us how the entire world is changing and how every nation must decide what kind of future it wants to build. Nigeria's importance in the world is much greater than most people realize. It is not just another developing country. It is a global player with more than 200 million people. It is the largest population in Africa and one of the youngest in the world. Every year, millions of Nigerians enter the workforce, ready to build businesses, create technology, and drive the economy forward. This makes Nigeria not only a source of raw materials, but also a massive future market for trade and innovation. Nigeria's economy is built on more than oil. It has fertile land for farming, valuable minerals, and a creative, educated population. Its film industry, Nollywood, is one of the largest in the world. Its technology sector is expanding rapidly, with startups in Lagos attracting global investors. All this gives Nigeria something many African countries lack: real economic weight. This strength is one reason the United States is so concerned. If Nigeria, Africa's biggest economy, succeeds in breaking free from Western financial control, others will follow. Countries like Kenya, Ghana, and South Africa could also begin to demand better trade deals and more independence. That could weaken the US dollar system and reduce American influence across the entire continent. For Washington, this is not just about Nigeria, it's about setting an example. If the US allows one large African country to sell oil in other currencies and stay independent, other nations will quickly do the same. And if more countries trade outside the dollar system, America's power to control world finance will shrink dramatically. That is why Trump's threats were so strong and so emotional. They came from fear of losing something that has given America control for decades. But military threats are dangerous, especially in a situation like this. Nigeria is not an enemy. It has never attacked the US, but never threatened its people, and never tried to spread violence. Its only crime was making an economic decision, deciding how it wants to sell its oil. So when Trump used words like vicious and suggested that military consequences might follow, the world reacted with alarm. It reminded many people of the Iraq War, a war started over accusations that later proved false. a war that destroyed a nation and damaged America's reputation. Nigeria's government has been careful not to make the situation worse. President Bola Tinubu has spoken calmly, choosing words of peace instead of anger. He said Nigeria does not seek confrontation, but it will not accept control. He also reminded other African leaders that when one country is bullied for making an independent decision, all countries should stand together. Behind the scenes, Nigeria has been building alliances to protect itself. It has reached out to the African Union, the BRICS countries, and even to European nations that are unhappy with America's aggressive tone. The goal is to create a strong diplomatic shield, a web of relationships that make it too costly for any superpower to attack. If the US acts against Nigeria, it would not just face one country, it would face political backlash from Africa, Asia, and even parts of Europe. Of course, Nigeria cannot match America's military power. The US has global bases, nuclear weapons, and the largest navy on Earth. But Nigeria understands something important. Wars today are not only fought with guns, they are fought with global opinion, with diplomacy, with trade, and with the power of unity. If America attacked Nigeria, it would look like a rich nation punishing a developing one for daring to make its own choices. That image would destroy America's moral standing across the world. Still, the risk of conflict is real. All it would take is one wrong move, a misunderstanding during military exercises, an explosion at an oil site, or an incident at sea, and tensions could escalate quickly. Once both sides start reacting out of fear instead of reason, the situation can spiral out of control. Yet there is still hope. Many voices inside the United States, from Congress, the Pentagon, and major business leaders, understand that a war with Nigeria would be a disaster. It would disrupt global markets, damage trade routes, and isolate America from the very countries it needs to work with. More importantly, it would make it clear that the US cannot adapt to the new world, a world where cooperation, not coercion, defines power. For now, diplomacy continues quietly. Nigeria keeps emphasizing respect and peace. The US, under growing global scrutiny, may realize that threats and force are outdated tools. If both nations can find common ground through dialogue and mutual respect, the crisis could end without violence. The next few months will decide whether the world moves toward partnership or confrontation. If reason wins, Nigeria's stand could become a symbol of peaceful strength, proof that even a developing nation can say no to intimidation and still hold its head high. If fear wins, the world could face another unnecessary conflict, one that benefits no one and hurts everyone. The standoff between the United States and Nigeria is not just a political story, it is a moral test, a question about what kind of world we want to live in. It forces us to ask, should power be used to control others or to cooperate with them? Should nations be free to make their own choices, or must they always obey the strongest? For a long time, the global system has been built on coercion. Rich countries make the rules and poorer ones are told to follow them. If they don't, they face sanctions, threats, or even invasion. This pattern has lasted for decades in Latin America, in the Middle East, and in Africa. But now that pattern is breaking. Nigeria's stand shows that a new generation of nations is no longer afraid. They are ready to be equal partners in the global family, not silent spectators. The situation today is tense, but it also carries hope. It shows that courage can exist even in the shadow of great power. Nigeria could have given in easily. It could have accepted Washington's demands and avoided trouble. But it chose a harder path to defend its sovereignty peacefully and intelligently. This courage is inspiring millions across the global south, from Latin America to Asia. Many nations are quietly watching and thinking, if Nigeria can stand up, maybe we can too. The crisis also reveals the truth about American leadership. For years, the United States has spoken about freedom, democracy, and the right of nations to choose their own path. But when another country actually exercises that right, when it makes a choice that Washington doesn't like, the response is anger, not respect. This gap between words and actions has damaged America's credibility. People around the world are asking, can a nation that threatens war over currency policy truly claim to defend liberty? For Americans themselves, this is an important moment of reflection. These decisions are made in their name, with their money, by leaders they elect. If citizens believe that threatening another nation for choosing its trade policy is wrong, they must speak up. True patriotism does not mean blind obedience. It means holding your country to the standards it claims to represent. America's real strength has always come, not from fear but from fairness. Respect cannot be forced, it must be earned. Nigeria's story also teaches a lesson about unity. Inside the country, people from many backgrounds are realizing that in moments of external pressure, internal division is a weapon others can use against them. Unity does not mean everyone agrees on everything. It means standing together when your nation's dignity is at stake. This moment could become a turning point in how Nigerians see themselves, not as separate groups, but as one people with a shared destiny. At a global level, this confrontation could shape the next decade. If it ends peacefully with dialogue and understanding, it will show that a multipolar world can exist without chaos. It will prove that countries can disagree and still coexist with respect. But if it turns violent, even through small miscalculations, it could trigger a chain of crises that would harm the entire world. Energy prices would rise, economies would suffer, and global trust would fall apart. So much depends on whether wisdom or pride will win. If Washington chooses humility in negotiation, it can still lead in a different way, by example, not by dominance. If Nigeria stays patient and united, it can protect its sovereignty and become a symbol for all nations seeking independence through peace. In the end, this is not a story about America versus Nigeria. It is a story about the future of international order, whether humanity will continue to live under systems of force or finally evolve toward fairness. The choice is not just in the hands of leaders, but of people everywhere. Citizens, voters, thinkers, journalists, all must decide what kind of world they will support, one ruled by fear or one guided by respect. The world is watching Nigeria, and through Nigeria, watching itself. The outcome will tell us whether smaller nations truly have a voice, or whether global power will continue to belong only to a few. Whatever happens next, one truth is already clear: the age of silent obedience is over. A new era is beginning, one where nations, big or small, are learning to stand, to speak, and to choose their own path. If the powerful can learn to listen, and the brave can hold firm without hate, then perhaps this crisis will not end in war, but in awakening. And that will be the moment when the world finally understands what true sovereignty means: not separation, but respect; not domination, but dialogue; not fear, but freedom. That is the hope Nigeria carries, not just for itself, but for the world. And if it succeeds, history will remember this moment not as the start of another conflict, but as the birth of a new balance, one built on equality, partnership, and peace.